Hi, this morning we're making our scone recipe, one of our favorites. So we've got everything ready to go. This is a pretty quick one to make, so we hope you try it and enjoy it. First up, we need flour, and it's easiest to weigh the flour if you have a kitchen scale. We'll want to tare to the bowl. A couple reasons being, one, you don't have to measure with a measuring cup, which is a lot quicker and easier. And two, the flour actually changes how much a cup weighs depending on how long it's been sitting. So if you've had your flour just recently, poured into a container, it's going to be a little fluffier. There's going to be less weight per cup. If you have had it sitting there for a while, it kind of packs down and you actually end up with more weight per cup. So you don't always know exactly how much you're getting. Next in, after the 9 ounces of flour, is a 1/3 cup of sugar. We need a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And a tablespoon of baking powder. And we'll get those all in there, and I just like to whisk them together so they're nicely blended. Now the recipe says the next thing you want to add is your dried fruit or your chocolate chips. I personally like to add the butter next. I think that if you go with the butter right away, it's easier to cut the butter in and you don't end up getting the fruit or the chocolate chips gumming up your pastry knife. So I just think it's smoother, easier, you get a better consistency in the end, and yeah, so I kind of do the recipe backwards in that way. So we want 6 tablespoons of butter, and we want it to be kind of chopped into smaller chunks. So I take my 6 tablespoons and just cut them up a little bit. You don't have to have any kind of exact cuts on these, just so they're a little smaller and easier to manage. You don't want them to be too small. That's going to be the one thing. Eventually, after you cut them in, you want the butter to be kind of the size of peas. So if you cut it that small in the beginning, you're going to have a hard time later in the process actually getting it to mix into the flour without getting the chunks too small. So there's our 6 tablespoons of butter. And this is a pastry knife or a pastry cutter. And it's a great tool for this because it's got all these little knives here that as you crush the butter, will crush it a number of pieces at a time. You could also use just a couple table knives while you do this. Hold both the table knives in your hand and go kind of with the same motion that I'm doing here. But what this does is it cuts the butter into the flour, and it cuts the butter into smaller pieces and coats all those smaller pieces with the flour. So the butter's kind of protected all around by flour granules. Now you don't want to cut the butter too small, because the way you get a flaky pastry is by having some good sized butter chunks in there. If the butter's completely mixed in, you're not going to get flaky pastry. You'll get more of like a doughy, homogeneous kind of pastry. So that's probably good. All my butter chunks, the biggest ones are about the size of peas, and that's what I'm looking for. So we'll clean that off quick. And then I go ahead and I add in my dried fruit or my chocolate chips or whatever. This morning is chocolate chips. So we'll put in, I usually do a little less than a cup. The amount isn't crucial, it doesn't have to be anything exact. If I'm using dried fruit, I'll use whatever I happen to have on hand, whatever mixture. If I'm using something larger like cherries, I do like to cut the cherries up. They just get a little bit big in the scones at the end. So I like to cut them till they're about the size of chocolate chips. Anything else, blueberries, currants, cranberries, I just leave alone. So we're good with that for now, and it's time for our wet ingredients. So in here, we're going to need about 3/4 cup of cream, and we love the Cedar Summit cream. It's the best one that we found. And I'm going to keep the cream out. We may need a little bit more in the future. We're going to add to that 2 teaspoons of vanilla. And we buy ours in industrial size because we do go through it. And then we want 2 egg yolks. And I'm going to save the whites for later in the recipe. Later on for the glaze, the recipe tells you to use 1 egg for the glaze. I prefer, instead of the 1 egg, to just use the 2 whites that I didn't use now. And you don't get exactly the same consistency, but it's still delicious and it works. So I'm going to put my whites into 1 bowl and my yolks into my ingredients here. And I like splitting my whites this way in the shell. Sometimes if the shell breaks a lot, this one might be a little tricky, you have to just break the whole egg into your hand and let the white run through your fingers. This method works well too. So I'm going to set this aside for later and go ahead and whisk my wet ingredients together. And once those are blended, we can put them in with the dry ingredients. Now you'll want to start by blending this all with a fork because it's pretty messy. So we'll get as much as we can in there and try to get it all relatively evenly blended in the beginning. And it's going to get tough in just a second. And that's where the fork will be less functional and your hands will do a better job. So at about this point, it's getting pretty hard. We're done with that. And I'm going to start blending. Now I'm not going to try to crush anything or blend anything perfectly. I kind of push and flip it and push and flip it. And my goal is to get the wet and the dry all mixed together, but without breaking up all of those butter chunks that I had in there before. And you can see here I've got a good amount of extra flour. It's going to have a hard time mixing in. So I'm just going to add a little bit more cream. Sometimes you need to add a little more flour. Sometimes it's perfect. It kind of depends on the humidity. It depends on exactly how accurate you were weighing and measuring. But you do want to, if you need to add flour or cream to get the consistency right, you want to do it sooner rather than later when you're mixing, because the goal is to do as little mixing as possible. And that's to keep that butter cold so it'll stay in its little chunks and to keep them from getting mixed in too much. So this is good. I have a ball that's staying together pretty well, and that's what I'm looking for at this stage. So we are ready to get this on the tray. And I have just a baking sheet with a Silpat sheet on here. I like these because they're reusable forever. You can just use a piece of parchment paper on the baking sheet and that works great too. So I'm going to make this into a disc and push it down until it's about 1 inch thick. No need to be exact, of course. That looks good. And then we're just going to cut that into 8 wedges. And I like to use a pastry scraper. You definitely don't need one of these. You could just use a knife as well. That would do a great job. And if you're making scones for a lot of people or as part of a breakfast buffet or something like that, sometimes I'll make these even smaller. Instead of 8, I'll make it into 10 or 12 wedges. And you just have to watch them in the oven and make sure that they're not cooking too long. So we'll arrange those. They don't spread a whole lot in the oven, but you want to make sure you get some room between them. And then we're going to go ahead and make our glaze. So this is the part where the recipe does say you want 1 whole egg. And I just use the whites that I've already used. If you want to save your whites, to make an omelet with your breakfast or something, certainly go ahead and use the whole egg. I'm putting my extra cream in. It says to use a tablespoon of milk or cream, and I just pour in whatever got left over in there. The only difference really between using the whites and the whole egg is the whites take longer to whisk up to be easily spreadable. So the whole egg, you won't have to do as much whisking here to make it easy to put it on the scones. The whites also just don't give you as golden of a color on top of the scones. We're using the glaze to brush on the top to give them a nice golden brown look and for the sugar to stick onto it. And the whites won't be as golden of color. So if you're going for really, really beautiful scones, you probably want to use a whole egg. This is my easy way to make it work. One other variation we'll do sometimes is to make savory scones instead of the breakfast scones that we're making now. So instead of putting in chocolate chips or fruit, maybe some chopped fresh rosemary or other herbs that you really like, omit the vanilla if you're doing the savory scones. And then we'll still do the egg glaze on top, but then instead of putting sugar over, some coarse sea salt or other herbs are kind of nice. So this looks like it'll be easy to spread on the scones here. This is just a pastry brush that we've got. And I'm just going to brush some of the egg glaze on the top of each. Now I tried once brushing it over the sides as well, thinking that would make them really pretty and nice and browned on all sides. However, I would recommend against it. What happens is once you get them in the oven, the glaze on the sides kind of melts down onto the tray and it makes a burned egg glaze all over the side of each scone. So you get nice looking scones, but they're surrounded by this kind of sea of ugly, smelly, burned egg. So just go for the top. You can learn from my mistake on that one. And our last task, after I clean all the dough off of my hands, is to get the sugar on top before we put them in the oven. And we like to use coarse sugar for this. So the raw cane sugar is great. It gives it a really nice crunch on top of the scone. And I use a lot more than the recipe calls for. It tells you about 2 teaspoons for the entire recipe, and I probably use a teaspoon per scone. I personally like the contrast of the crunchy sugar on top and the flaky scone in the middle. So I go ahead and throw a bunch on. And again, this is where if you're making a savory scone, you could put some coarse sea salt, definitely not in this quantity. Some other herbs. You can just leave them alone too. You don't need anything on top. I've got my oven preheated to 400 degrees, so that is ready to go for me. And at this point, scones are done. So we're going to pop them in the oven. Takes 18 to 22 minutes. What you'll want to do when they're done is look at them. If they look golden brown, they're good. I don't actually check them with a toothpick. Just kind of go by the color and make sure they look like they're all cooked on the outsides. So we'll see you in 20 minutes. So it's been about 19 minutes. The kitchen smells awesome. And the scones look nicely golden. So you can see they're golden on the top, on the bottom. They look like they're browned and ready to go. So I'm sure they are perfect inside. So I'm going to transfer them straight onto a cooling rack. And according to the recipe, you're supposed to wait 10 minutes before you eat them. Which is probably wise, since the chocolate chips are probably hot and could probably burn your mouth. But we've never actually been able to wait 10 whole minutes, so we go as long as we can and then dig in. Just be careful. Enjoy.